Sarah Martinez had been serving coffee and peanuts in the sky for 12 years, but this Tuesday morning felt different. As she walked through the narrow aisle of Flight 447, checking passenger seatbelts before takeoff, something in the air seemed thick with tension. The Boeing 737 was packed with business travelers heading from Kiev to Amsterdam, their faces buried in laptops and newspapers, unaware that this routine flight would become the most terrifying experience of their lives. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom with his usual pre-flight announcement, but Sarah noticed his tone was more serious than usual. Captain Johnson had mentioned during the crew briefing that they would be flying over a region where military activity had been reported, but commercial flights had been cleared to continue their regular routes. The aviation authorities had assured them it was safe. Sarah adjusted her blue uniform jacket and smiled at a nervous elderly woman in seat 12A who was gripping her husband's hand. "First time flying?" Sarah asked gently, leaning down to the woman's level. The passenger nodded, her eyes wide with anxiety. "Don't worry, we'll take great care of you today. Flying is still the safest way to travel." Sarah's words were meant to comfort, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach since arriving at the airport that morning. The takeoff was smooth, and within 20 minutes, they had reached their cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. Sarah began her routine service, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle with her colleague Emma, a newer flight attendant who was still learning the ropes. The passengers seemed relaxed now, some already dozing off, others chatting quietly or reading. A businessman in an expensive suit ordered his third cup of coffee, joking that he needed the caffeine to survive his upcoming board meeting. As Sarah poured coffee into small plastic cups, she glanced out the small aircraft windows. The landscape below looked peaceful from this height, with patchwork fields stretching endlessly under the clear morning sky. She had flown this route dozens of times before, but today the view seemed different somehow. Maybe it was the way the sunlight hit the ground, or perhaps it was her imagination playing tricks on her. Emma was struggling with the coffee pot, trying to balance it while the aircraft hit some mild turbulence. Sarah reached over to help her, their friendship having grown strong over the past 6 months of flying together. They worked as a team, Sarah's experience guiding Emma through the small challenges that came with serving refreshments at 30,000 feet. Neither of them could have imagined that in just 30 minutes their training would be put to a test far beyond anything they had learned in flight attendant school. The elderly woman from seat 12A called Sarah over, asking for an extra blanket. As Sarah retrieved one from the overhead compartment, she noticed the woman's husband was reading a newspaper with headlines about rising tensions in Eastern Europe. The man folded the paper quickly when he saw Sarah looking, as if trying to shield her from the troubling news. Sarah smiled politely and handed over the blanket, but her uneasy feeling was growing stronger. Captain Johnson's voice came over the intercom again, this time asking passengers to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts due to expected turbulence ahead. Sarah and Emma quickly secured the beverage cart and began walking through the cabin, checking that everyone was properly buckled in. The atmosphere on the plane remained calm, with most passengers assuming this was just another routine safety precaution. As Sarah made her way toward the back of the aircraft, she noticed one of the passengers near the window seemed agitated. He was pointing at something outside and trying to get the attention of the person sitting next to him. Sarah approached them with a professional smile, ready to address whatever concern they might have. The man looked up at her with wide eyes and said something that made her blood run cold. "Miss, there's something strange in the sky," he whispered, not wanting to alarm other passengers. "It looks like there are objects moving very fast, and they don't look like regular aircraft." Sarah's heart began to race as she moved to the window to look for herself. What she saw in the distance made her realize that this was not going to be an ordinary flight. Dark objects were visible against the blue sky, moving in ways that commercial aircraft never moved. Sarah maintained her calm exterior, but inside her training kicked in. She knew she needed to inform the captain immediately, but she also needed to keep the passengers from panicking. She walked quickly toward the front of the aircraft, her mind racing as she tried to process what she had just seen. The routine, coffee service had suddenly become secondary to something far more serious, and she could sense that their lives were about to change forever. The aircraft continued its steady path through the sky, its passengers unaware that they were flying directly into one of the most dangerous situations in aviation history. Sarah's 12 years of experience had prepared her for medical emergencies, difficult passengers, and even emergency landings. But nothing had prepared her for what was about to happen next. As she reached for the intercom to contact the cockpit, she whispered a small prayer, hoping that her fears were unfounded and that the strange objects in the sky were nothing more than military exercises. Sarah picked up the aircraft phone and dialed the cockpit, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to maintain her professional composure. Captain Johnson answered immediately, his voice tense but controlled. "Sarah, we've been monitoring some unusual activity on our radar. We're in contact with air traffic control right now. Keep the passengers calm and prepare for possible course changes." Before Sarah could respond, the aircraft suddenly lurched to the left, causing several passengers to gasp in surprise. This wasn't the gentle turbulence they had been warned about earlier. Through the intercom, Captain Johnson's voice filled the cabin, but this time his tone was different, urgent but measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected air traffic in our area, and will need to alter our flight path slightly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Emma appeared at Sarah's side, her face pale with concern. "What's happening?" she whispered. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her colleague's shoulder while scanning the cabin. Most passengers seemed only mildly concerned, assuming this was routine, but a few had noticed the tension in the crew's behavior. The businessman who had ordered 3 cups of coffee was now staring out the window with a worried expression. Sarah made her way down the aisle, offering reassuring smiles and checking on passengers. The elderly woman in seat 12A looked frightened, so Sarah stopped to kneel beside her. "Is everything all right, dear?" the woman asked, her voice shaking slightly. Sarah took her hand gently. "Just a small detour, nothing to worry about. These things happen sometimes with air traffic." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah's own heart was pounding with uncertainty. The aircraft phone rang again, and Sarah hurried to answer it. "This time," Captain Johnson's voice was more urgent. "Sarah, I need you and Emma to quietly begin preparing for emergency procedures. Don't alarm the passengers, but review your emergency manual and ensure all safety equipment is accessible. We're dealing with a situation that's developing rapidly." Sarah's training kicked into high gear. She had practiced emergency procedures countless times during recertification courses, but this was the first time she might actually need to use them. She caught Emma's attention and quietly gestured for her to check the emergency equipment locations. They moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, their actions looking routine to passengers but actually preparing for potential crisis. Through the small aircraft windows, Sarah could see they were now flying over unfamiliar terrain. The peaceful farmland had given way to more rugged landscape, and she realized they had significantly changed course from their original flight path to Amsterdam. The aircraft was also flying lower than their usual cruising altitude, and she could feel the change in air pressure in her ears. A child in seat 8B began crying, sensing the tension in the air even though she couldn't understand what was happening. Sarah went to comfort her, speaking in gentle tones while her mother tried to calm her down. "Sometimes planes need to take different paths, just like cars on a highway," Sarah explained to the little girl. "The pilots are very smart and know exactly what they're doing." The passenger who had first spotted the strange objects was now openly staring out his window, his face pressed against the glass. Sarah approached him carefully. "Sir, is there something I can help you with?" He turned to her with frightened eyes. "Those objects are still out there and they're getting closer. I've never seen anything move like that before. Are we in danger?" Before Sarah could answer, the aircraft shook violently, not from turbulence, but from what felt like a pressure wave. The lights flickered momentarily and several passengers cried out in alarm. Sarah grabbed the nearest seat back to steady herself, her mind racing as she tried to understand what was happening. This was far beyond anything in her emergency training manual. Captain Johnson's voice came over the intercom again, this time with barely controlled urgency. "Flight attendants, please take your emergency positions immediately. Passengers, please ensure your seatbelts are tightly fastened and review the safety card in your seat pocket." We are following emergency protocols as a precautionary measure. The word emergency sent a ripple of fear through the cabin. Passengers who had been calmly reading or sleeping were now fully alert, looking around with worried expressions. Some began pulling out their phones, but there was no signal at this altitude. Sarah and Emma moved quickly to their emergency positions, their eyes meeting in shared understanding that whatever was happening was far more serious than either of them had ever experienced. Sarah's mind flashed back to all the routine flights she had worked, all the ordinary days of serving coffee and peanuts, helping passengers with their luggage and dealing with minor complaints about seat assignments. Those simple problems seemed incredibly trivial now as she prepared for something that could threaten the lives of everyone aboard Flight 447. The aircraft continued its altered course, flying lower and faster than usual. Through the windows, passengers could see they were now over what appeared to be military terrain, with unusual structures and vehicles visible on the ground below. The comfortable routine of their morning flight had transformed into something none of them could have imagined when they boarded just hours earlier. As Sarah checked her emergency equipment one more time, she realized that her 12 years of experience might not be enough for whatever was about to happen. The missiles that would soon appear in their sky would test every bit of training, courage, and instinct she possessed. The first explosion came without warning, a distant flash of light followed by a rumble that shook the aircraft like thunder. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the plane tilted sharply to the right, sending unbuckled items flying across the cabin. Passengers screamed, and the child who had been crying earlier was now wailing in terror. Sarah gripped her emergency position seat, her knuckles white with tension. "What was that?" Emma shouted over the noise of frightened passengers and the aircraft's engines, which were now roaring at maximum power. Through the windows, passengers could see streaks of light cutting through the sky around them, moving at impossible speeds. These weren't the strange objects from earlier anymore. These were clearly weapons, and they were close enough to see, clearly. Captain Johnson's voice came over the intercom, but it was crackling with static and barely audible above the chaos in the cabin. "Emergency descent, immediate. All crew, brace positions." The transmission cut out, leaving Sarah and Emma to rely on their training without clear direction from the cockpit. Sarah realized they were completely on their own to manage the passengers. Another explosion lit up the sky, this one much closer. The shockwave hit their aircraft with tremendous force, causing oxygen masks to drop from the overhead compartments. The cabin filled with the mechanical sound of masks deploying and the hiss of oxygen flowing. Sarah immediately began moving through the cabin, helping passengers secure their masks while fighting against the aircraft's violent movements. "Put your own mask on first, then help others," Sarah called out, remembering her safety training. But in the chaos, many passengers were too panicked to follow instructions properly. The businessman who had ordered 3 coffees was hyperventilating into his oxygen mask, his expensive suit now wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. Sarah reached him quickly, speaking in calm, clear tones despite her own fear. The elderly woman in seat 12A was struggling with her mask, her hands shaking too badly to secure it properly. Her husband was trying to help her while managing his own mask, both of them looking terrified. Sarah pushed through the aisle, which was now tilted at an alarming angle as the aircraft continued its emergency descent, and helped them both get properly secured. Through the chaos, Sarah could see Emma at the front of the cabin, helping a mother with 2 small children get their masks on. The younger child, probably only 3 years old, was fighting the mask and crying hysterically. Emma was speaking softly to him, trying to make it seem like a game, but Sarah could see the fear in her colleagues' eyes. None of their training had prepared them for managing passengers during an active missile attack. The aircraft shook again, this time from what felt like a direct impact, though Sarah realized it must have been another near miss. The lights went out completely for several seconds, leaving them in darkness except for the emergency lighting that automatically activated. In those terrifying moments of darkness, the only sounds were the screaming of passengers and the changed pitch of the aircraft engines. When the lights flickered back on, Sarah could see that some passengers had been thrown from their seats during the violent maneuvers. A middle-aged man near the middle of the aircraft was holding his arm clearly injured, while blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. Sarah knew she needed to help him, but she also knew that keeping everyone calm and properly secured was her first priority. "Everyone stay in your seats," Sarah called out as loudly as she could. "Keep your masks on and your seatbelts tight. We're going to get through this." Her voice carried more confidence than she felt, but she knew that passenger panic could be as dangerous as the missiles outside. She had to project strength even though her own heart was racing with terror. The passenger who had first spotted the strange objects was now pressed against his window, watching the aerial combat happening around them. "They're shooting at everything in the sky," he shouted to anyone who would listen. "Those are surface-to-air missiles. We're in the middle of a war zone." His words sent another wave of panic through the cabin, and Sarah realized she needed to control the information flow. "Please stay away from the windows and focus on following safety procedures," Sarah announced. But it was difficult to be heard over the noise of the engines and the continued explosions outside. The aircraft was descending rapidly now, and she could feel the change in pressure in her ears. They were dropping altitude fast, probably trying to get below the range of whatever weapons were being fired. Emma made her way toward Sarah, moving carefully through the tilted aisle while holding onto seatbacks for support. When she reached Sarah, her face was pale but determined. "The cockpit isn't responding to calls," she said quietly. "I think we're on our own back here." Sarah nodded, understanding that they might be dealing with more than just a frightening detour. The pilots might be dealing with damage to their aircraft systems. As another missile streaked past their windows, close enough that passengers could see its exhaust trail clearly, Sarah realized that their survival might depend entirely on the decisions made in the next few minutes. The routine flight that had started with complaints about coffee temperature and requests for extra blankets had become a life-or-death situation that would test every bit of courage and training she possessed. The aircraft continued its desperate descent toward what Sarah hoped would be safety, but with missiles still visible outside the windows, she knew they weren't out of danger yet. The coffee service seemed like a memory from another lifetime as she prepared for whatever would come next. The aircraft's descent became so steep that Sarah had to hold on to seatbacks to keep from sliding forward. She could hear the engines straining as Captain Johnson pushed the plane to its limits, trying to get them out of the missile zone as quickly as possible. The pressure change was making many passengers' ears pop painfully, and several people were becoming nauseous from the violent maneuvers. Suddenly, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood freeze. It was a whistling noise, growing louder and louder, coming from outside the aircraft. She had heard this sound in war movies, but experiencing it in real life was terrifying beyond anything she could have imagined. "Everyone get down," she shouted instinctively, throwing herself across the aisle to shield two passengers. The explosion was massive, close enough that the aircraft was lifted and thrown sideways by the blast wave. Sarah felt herself flying through the air before crashing into the opposite wall of the cabin. For a moment, everything went silent and dark. When she regained consciousness seconds later, she could taste blood in her mouth and feel a sharp pain in her shoulder. The cabin was in chaos. Oxygen masks were swinging wildly. Carry-on luggage had been thrown from overhead compartments, and passengers were crying and shouting. The aircraft was still flying, but Sarah could tell something was seriously wrong. The plane was shaking, in ways that weren't normal, and she could hear what sounded like wind rushing through parts of the cabin where wind shouldn't be able to enter. Emma was pulling herself up from the floor near the front of the aircraft, blood running from a cut above her left eye. Despite her injury, she immediately began checking on passengers in her section. Sarah felt a surge of admiration for her colleagues' professionalism under such extreme circumstances. Together, they began the process of assessing injuries and trying to restore some order to the chaos. The injured man from earlier was now unconscious, and Sarah realized he needed immediate medical attention. "Is there a doctor on board?" she called out, hoping someone with medical training was among the passengers. A woman near the back of the aircraft raised her hand. "I'm a nurse," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt carefully and making her way forward through the debris-filled aisle. The nurse, who introduced herself as Janet, quickly began examining the unconscious passenger. "He has a head injury and possible internal bleeding," she reported to Sarah. "We need to keep him stable, but he requires hospital treatment as soon as possible." Sarah nodded, adding medical emergency to the growing list of crises they were managing. Captain Johnson's voice finally came through the intercom again, though it was weak and filled with static. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have sustained some damage to the aircraft, but we are still airworthy. We are attempting an emergency landing at the nearest available airport. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures." Sarah felt a mix of relief and terror. Relief that they were still flying and had communication with the cockpit, but terror at the words emergency landing. She had practiced these procedures dozens of times in training, but never under combat conditions with injured passengers and a damaged aircraft. She and Emma would need to coordinate the emergency preparation while continuing to manage frightened passengers. The first step was to secure any loose items that could become dangerous projectiles during landing. Sarah and Emma began moving through the cabin, gathering scattered luggage and personal items. The elderly woman from seat 12A grabbed Sarah's arm as she passed. "Are we going to die?" she asked with tears in her eyes. Sarah took her hand firmly. "No, we are not going to die. We have excellent pilots and we're going to land safely." As Sarah spoke those words, she realized she genuinely believed them. Despite everything that had happened, despite the missiles and explosions and damage to their aircraft, she had absolute faith in Captain Johnson's ability to get them down safely. Her fear was being replaced by determination to do her job and help every passenger survive this crisis. Emma was working with Janet the nurse to secure the injured passenger for landing. They used blankets and pillows to create a makeshift stretcher in the aisle, knowing that the landing might be rough. Other passengers with minor injuries were being helped by fellow travelers, creating a sense of community that often emerges during disasters. The aircraft was still descending rapidly, and, through the windows, Sarah could see they were now flying over what appeared to be a military base or airport. The runway lights were clearly visible in the distance, along with emergency vehicles that had been positioned for their arrival. The sight of those emergency vehicles was both comforting and frightening, confirming that their situation was serious, but also showing that help was waiting for them. "Prepare for emergency landing," Captain Johnson's voice boomed through the intercom. "Brace positions in 30 seconds. Sarah and Emma quickly took their emergency positions, but Sarah's eyes remained focused on the passengers, making sure everyone was properly prepared. The child who had been crying earlier was now being held tightly by her mother, both of them in the correct brace position. As Sarah assumed her own brace position, she thought about how her ordinary day of serving coffee and peanuts had become the most important day of her career. Every bit of training, every emergency drill, every moment of experience had led to this critical moment when the lives of everyone on Flight 447 would depend on their preparation and professional response to an unimaginable crisis. The impact with the runway was harder than any landing Sarah had ever experienced. The aircraft bounced twice before settling onto the ground with a grinding, screeching sound that suggested the landing gear was damaged. Sarah felt her teeth rattle as they decelerated rapidly, the engines screaming in reverse thrust. Through the chaos, she could hear Captain Johnson fighting to control the aircraft as it veered slightly off the center line. Sparks flew past the windows as damaged parts of the aircraft scraped against the concrete runway. Sarah remained in her brace position, but her eyes stayed open, watching the passengers to ensure everyone was following emergency procedures correctly. The businessman who had ordered 3 cups of coffee was now gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned white, but he was maintaining the correct position. When the aircraft finally came to a complete stop, there was a moment of absolute silence that felt surreal after the chaos of the past hour. Then Captain Johnson's voice came over the intercom, stronger and clearer than it had been since the missile attack began. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Prague Emergency Airport. Please remain seated while the flight attendants assess the situation and prepare for evacuation." Sarah immediately unbuckled herself and stood up, fighting through the pain in her injured shoulder. The cabin was filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burned electronics, but the aircraft was intact and everyone appeared to be alive. Emma was already moving toward the emergency exits, checking to see which ones were viable for evacuation. Outside the windows, Sarah could see dozens of emergency vehicles surrounding their aircraft, their flashing lights creating a surreal light show. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to evacuate the aircraft immediately," Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Please listen carefully to instructions and move quickly but carefully. Leave all personal belongings behind. Your life is more important than anything in your luggage." She had given this speech in training dozens of times, but never with real urgency behind every word. Emma called from the front of the aircraft. "Front exits are clear." Sarah checked the rear exits and found them also safe to use. The evacuation slides had automatically deployed when the doors were opened, and she could see emergency personnel positioned at the bottom of each slide to help passengers as they reached the ground. The nurse, Janet, was helping prepare the injured passenger for evacuation. The process of evacuating 147 passengers might have taken much longer under normal circumstances, but the shared experience of surviving the missile attack had created an extraordinary level of cooperation. Passengers helped each other toward the exits, with stronger individuals assisting those who were injured or elderly. The mother with the small child was being helped by 3 other passengers who had formed an impromptu support team around her family. Sarah positioned herself at the rear exit, helping passengers onto the evacuation slide while Emma managed the front exits. "Sit down, cross your arms, slide down quickly," she repeated over and over, guiding each person safely out of the aircraft. The elderly woman from seat 12A looked terrified of the slide, but her husband encouraged her gently, and Sarah helped position her correctly before she slid down to safety. The unconscious passenger required special handling. Janet, the nurse, coordinated with emergency medical personnel who had boarded the aircraft to help evacuate him on a proper stretcher. Sarah watched as they carefully carried him toward the exit, knowing that his survival depended on getting him to a hospital quickly. The professional efficiency of the medical team gave her hope that he would recover fully from his injuries. As the last passengers slid down to safety, Sarah took a final look around the cabin that had been her workplace for the morning and nearly become her final resting place. The coffee service cart was overturned in the aisle, plastic cups and napkins scattered everywhere. The routine items of her normal workday seemed like artifacts from another world, compared to the life-or-death emergency they had all survived. Emma appeared at Sarah's side as they prepared to be the last ones to leave the aircraft, following standard emergency procedures that crew members evacuate last. "We did it," Emma said, her voice filled with exhaustion and amazement. "We actually got everyone out alive." Sarah nodded, feeling the same mixture of relief and disbelief. Her 12 years of experience had culminated in the most important 30 minutes of her career. Together, Sarah and Emma slid down the evacuation slides, leaving behind the damaged aircraft that had carried them through a missile attack and brought them safely to ground. As her feet touched the runway, Sarah felt the solid earth beneath her and realized how precious that feeling was after spending the most terrifying hour of her life, wondering if she would ever feel ground beneath her feet again. Emergency personnel immediately surrounded them, checking for injuries and guiding them toward waiting buses that would take all passengers and crew to a secure location for medical evaluation and debriefing. Sarah looked back at Flight 447, its damaged exterior telling the story of their miraculous survival. Scorch marks and small holes in the fuselage showed how close they had come to disaster. As she climbed onto the evacuation bus, Sarah saw all of her passengers being cared for by medical personnel and support staff. The child who had been crying was now laughing as a paramedic let her listen to his stethoscope. The businessman was on his phone, probably calling his family to let them know he was safe. The elderly couple was holding hands tightly, both of them crying with relief. In that moment, Sarah realized that her job as a flight attendant had never been more important or meaningful than it was during those critical minutes at 30,000 feet, when missiles filled the sky around them. She had served coffee that morning, but more importantly, she had served her passengers' lives when it mattered most. 3 weeks later, Sarah Martinez sat in a quiet coffee shop in downtown Prague, staring at her reflection in the window. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow marks, and her shoulder no longer ached constantly, but the memories of Flight 447 remained as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. She had been staying in Prague while investigators interviewed everyone connected to the incident, trying to piece together exactly what had happened in the sky that day. The newspapers had called them the miracle flight, and their story had been covered by news outlets around the world. Sarah had received hundreds of messages from people praising her actions during the emergency, but she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had simply done her job under extraordinary circumstances, though she was beginning to understand that sometimes doing your job under impossible conditions is exactly what heroism looks like. Emma walked into the coffee shop and sat down across from her, carrying a folder full of documents. They had been meeting every few days since the incident, partly because the investigation required their continued cooperation, but mostly because they were the only two people who truly understood what they had experienced together. Their bond had deepened far beyond a normal working relationship. "The final investigation report came out today," Emma said, sliding the folder across the table. Sarah opened it and began reading the technical language that described their near-death experience in cold, factual terms. The aircraft had been caught in the middle of an unannounced military exercise involving surface-to-air missile testing. Multiple communication failures had resulted in their flight path not being properly cleared of the testing zone. According to the report, Captain Johnson had performed exceptional flying under combat conditions, and the flight crew had managed the emergency evacuation with professional excellence that likely prevented any loss of life. Sarah smiled sadly as she read those words, knowing they could never fully capture the terror and determination they had all felt during those critical minutes. "How's our injured passenger doing?" Sarah asked. Emma's face brightened with the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her in weeks. "Janet called this morning. He's going to make a full recovery. He's actually planning to send thank you cards to everyone who helped him during the evacuation. He says he doesn't remember much about the flight, but he remembers people taking care of him." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. During the darkest moments of that day, she had wondered if her efforts to help passengers were making any real difference. Learning that the man who had seemed closest to death was now recovering gave meaning to every difficult decision she had made during the crisis. The elderly woman from seat 12A had also sent a letter to Sarah through the airline. In careful handwriting, she had described how Sarah's calm presence and reassuring words had given her the strength to follow emergency procedures even when she was terrified. "You made me feel safe even when we weren't safe," the letter had said. "That's a gift that can't be taught in any training program." Captain Johnson had visited Sarah and Emma several times during their stay in Prague. He had explained the technical aspects of what had happened, how the missile explosions had damaged some of their aircraft systems, and how close they had come to a much worse outcome. But he had also thanked them repeatedly for their management of the passenger cabin, saying that their professionalism had allowed him to focus on flying without worrying about panic or disorder behind him. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Emma said quietly. "I keep wondering if I want to keep flying after this. I mean, what are the chances something like this could happen again?" Sarah understood her colleague's uncertainty. The aviation industry was statistically very safe, but their experience had shown them that sometimes statistics don't matter when you're the one facing an extraordinary situation. "I've been thinking about that too," Sarah replied. "But I realized something yesterday when I was talking to that little girl's mother on the phone. She told me that her daughter isn't afraid of flying anymore because she knows there are people like us on every plane, people who will take care of passengers no matter what happens. That made me remember why I became a flight attendant in the first place." Sarah had always known that her job involved more than serving refreshments and demonstrating safety procedures. Flight attendants were safety professionals, trained to handle medical emergencies, evacuations, and crisis situations. But until Flight 447, she had never fully understood the weight of that responsibility or how much difference her training and experience could make in truly critical moments. The coffee shop was filling up with the evening crowd, and Sarah noticed several people glancing in their direction. Their story had been widely reported, and they were occasionally recognized in public. Most people were respectful and supportive, but the attention was something neither of them was entirely comfortable with. They had done their jobs, and they didn't feel like celebrities. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Emma pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a message she had received that morning. It was from the businessman who had ordered 3 cups of coffee on Flight 447. He had written that he thought about their professionalism every day, and that their calm competence had helped him survive the most frightening experience of his life. He had also mentioned that he now always thanked flight attendants personally on every flight he took. Walking through the streets of Prague, Sarah reflected on how much her perspective had changed in 3 short weeks. She had always taken pride in her work, but now she understood that being a flight attendant meant being prepared to face the unthinkable and still find ways to serve and protect the people in her care. The missiles that had filled their sky had tested every aspect of her training and character, and she had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. Flight 447 had started as a routine morning, with Sarah serving coffee and peanuts at 30,000 feet. It had become a testament to human resilience, professional dedication, and the power of training and teamwork under pressure. As she walked through Prague's historic streets, Sarah knew that when she returned to flying, she would carry the lessons and confidence from that extraordinary day with her forever. The coffee service would continue, but she would never again underestimate the sacred trust passengers place in their flight crew every time they board an aircraft.